All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Thanks especially to our featured guest today, Dr. Stephen J. Hartnett, who is joining us from the University of Colorado, Denver. He's the author of the recent book that we'll be discussing today, and you see on the screen there, The Lost Chance in China and the Rise of Cold War Populism from Michigan State University Press, and that just came out, brand new book from the fall. I want to introduce Dr. Hartnett. I don't want to carry on too much about the book, except to say that it's delightful and it is urgent in what it's doing. But I'll introduce Dr. Hartnett, and then I'll provide one rave from a very esteemed scholar of communications. Dr. Hartnett is professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Colorado, Denver. He is the director of the UCD College and Prison Program, served as the 2017 president of the National Communication Association, and is the editor of Captured Words, Free Thoughts, the annual arts and politics magazine. He's published 10 books, including A World of Turmoil, The United States, China, and Taiwan in the Long Cold War, and the co-edited Imagining China, Rhetorics of Nationalism in an Age of Globalization. His scholarship on international affairs has appeared in Presidential Studies Quarterly, the International Journal of Communication, Rhetoric and Public Affairs, the Taiwan Journal of Democracy, the Journal of International Intercultural Communications, and the Quarterly Journal of Speech. His journalism on U.S.-China-Taiwan relations has appeared in SupChina, Public Seminar, New Lines Magazine, and Communication Currents. He has served since 2016 as one of the co-organizers for 5 conferences in Beijing, one in Shenzhen, one in Hong Kong, and one online conference in Shanghai during COVID. He's been awarded the Coors Campbell Prize in Rhetorical Criticism, the James A. Winans Herbert and A. Wishelman's Memorial Award for Distinguished Scholarship in Rhetoric and Public Address, the Association for Chinese Communication Studies Xiao Award for Understanding Rhetorical Research, and the University of Colorado's Thomas Jefferson Award. I'll be sharing notes about Dr. Hartnett's bio and also the new book that'll be under discussion. We do have a few copies that lucky attendees will win at the end of the session. And I just want to share one quote. We have some folks in from my SSCI 3010 Revolutions class, and they're familiar with the work of Grace Lee Boggs. And this scholar, Guobin Yang, is the Grace Lee Boggs Professor of Communication and Sociology at the Annenberg School for Communication and Department of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. And he says of Dr. Hartnett's book, when a distinguished scholar of rhetoric and communication goes into the archives of Washington and China in the 1940s, nothing short of a dazzling history of Cold War McCarthyite populism results. This erudite book is as important to history, China studies, and international relations as it is to media and communication scholars. The lessons of the past it meticulously untangles offer sobering warnings to the present. Thank you, Dr. Hartnett. That is high praise indeed from one of the most distinguished scholars in the country. Thank you for joining us. It's an absolute delight, and I look forward to hearing about the book.
Thank you, Jeremy. Golly, that's a very sweet introduction. Next time I'm having a bad day, I'm going to call you up again and ask you to read that. It's really an honor to be here to meet with you and your students and your colleagues. Thank you for the invitation. And you can all see there's the cover of the book and the title of the book. That's Patrick J. Hurley and Mao getting off a plane on their way to another round of failed negotiations. Before I get into the book, I just want to say thanks to Dr. Murray for the invitation. Thanks to the audience. And I thought instead of lecturing, I would just show a series of slides with images with some historical notes. And I'm hoping we can make this very conversational. So I want to invite you all in the audience to just jump in with questions or comments, and we can really kind of make this more like a good conversation than me just talking at you. And just by way of background, as Dr. Murray said, I've been working in China now for 18 years. And I gave you some photographs there on the bottom of the page. Those are what our conferences in China look like. And if you look closely, I think you can see Guobin Yang in the front row in the photo on the left. He's become a good friend and a collaborator on these conferences. And I would encourage all of you, if any of you would like to participate in these conferences, shoot me an email. Love to hook you up and get you over to China to meet our colleagues and allies over there. Really thriving intellectual scene in China right now, so I'd love to have you join the fun over there. All right, so just as a quick overview, the book tries to do three things. The first thing it does is it reconsiders a group of U.S. Foreign Service personnel who were stationed in China. And it sounds like you're all still working on periods prior to this, but you may know the names of John Service, John Davies, Owen Lattimore, a series of Americans who just got hammered by McCarthy and were called communists and all lost their jobs. And I, just by circumstance, have met some of their family members, some of their grandchildren. And I thought, these guys deserve better. So I started the book wanting to reclaim them and to kind of recover their history, recover their dignity. And so a lot of what is in the book, a lot of the, like, particularly the photographs, I got from their family. So step one of the book is I want to just reclaim these guys from getting hammered by the McCarthyites. Second thing the book does is it tries to make sense of what happened to U.S. foreign policy right around the end of the World War II, start of the Civil War, Chinese Civil War, and so on. And I should say by training, it sounds like you all are becoming China specialists. I'm an Americanist by training, and so my comfort zone is to really dig into American archives and to look at congressional debates and State Department debates. And so I'm really a foreign policy guy looking at this relationship through the American lens. And then the third thing the book does, and this just happened by mistake, it didn't start out this way, is that it unpacks the rhetorical history of Patrick Hurley. He's the chief protagonist, and how everything he did in China morphed into McCarthyism. And I started the book during COVID, and it was only after Trump really kind of started to do what I believe are crazy things that the parallels between McCarthy and Trump started to emerge. And so as I went into McCarthy and as I went into Hurley, it was just uncanny, the echoes, the rhymes that kept coming back. And so by the end of the book, it really was almost a prehistory to Trumpism. And so the book tries to do those three things. So what I'll do now is I'll just show you a bunch of slides. And in the slides, all quotations are referenced not to their original source, just because that would take up too much space, but to the pages where they appear in the book. So let's just jump in here. So here's Chiang Kai-shek on the cover of Time magazine, September 3rd, 1945. Now remember, the U.S. had just bombed Japan a month earlier, so the war had just ended. And the first cover of Time magazine after the end of the war was a picture of the Japanese flag with a big black X over it. So, we all talk about cancel culture today. So Time magazine was canceling Japan. And the next issue after the end of the war was a portrait of General Douglas MacArthur, who is considered the hero of the Pacific. It wasn't until the Korean War that he really kind of went off the rails and lost his honor. At the time, he was a national hero. So he was the second cover. And the third cover, I mean, think about the significance here. This is the third cover of what was then the most prominent magazine in America, is Chiang. And so Henry Luce, the editor, the publisher, is setting up Chiang as a national hero. And I don't know how much you all, if you've encountered Henry Luce in your work, he confessed to a reporter later on in China. You can see the quotation on the screen there. Notice in the quotation that Luce doesn't say we're advancing democracy. He doesn't say we're advancing capitalism or liberalism. He says it's a commitment to advancing Christianity. So for Luce, the kingpin behind the Time magazine empire, this was really a messianic mission, right? This is an evangelical mission. This is about bringing Christianity to the heathens in China. And I think that's important to know why Chiang lands on the cover. This picture is the sixth time that Chiang appeared on the cover of Time magazine. And at that point, up until 1945, no one had appeared on Time that much. Not Abraham Lincoln, right? Nobody. So Chiang was the single most prominent cover of Time magazine. That shows you how much Luce was committed to him. The accompanying story in the magazine was just so wacky, so crazy, that The Nation and Harper's Magazine and other reality-based outlets wrote extensive critiques of it. So this became this kind of media battle indicative of the fault lines within American culture around the end of the war in 1945. So the book starts there. So now, before I jump on, questions, comments, anybody from the floor want to jump in, or should I just roll on?
I can, if folks raise their hand here as comments come up, I will pass them on. Um,
Okay.
and I'll be the sort of go-between here. And also folks in the Zoom meeting, because Dr. Hartnett's happy with these interjections, if folks have questions, comments, please feel free to virtually raise your hand and or post a question to the chat, and I will flag Dr. Hartnett down as those come up. But Stephen, just go ahead and
Okay.
let's keep.
All right, so this picture sets up the scene in 1945 for this looming cultural war in which Christianity, a magazine with almost monopolistic control over the press and so on, are all pushing a kind of anti-communist message. Now, here's this map. I'm going to show you this map. Now, you all are becoming China experts. You probably are familiar with this. It's important to know when you look at a map of China that what we call China during World War II was just an absolute disaster. And so if you look up in the northeast there of that map, what the map labels Manchukuo, that was territory that Japan had colonized early in the war and that had over 1 million personnel in Manchukuo. Then you see the Mongolian People's Republic, uh, the Ma clique, kind of warlord. Tibet was still then independent. You can see the Indian Empire, British possession, etc., etc. What you're seeing here is that there is no unified nation state. And what you're seeing here is that China is surrounded by enemies, right? Japan to the east, British colonial India to the west, USSR up to the northwest, and so on. And what's called nationalist China there, the kind of dark gray band. It's important to know that by the summer of 44, most of that territory had also been conquered by the invading Japanese Empire. So that pink swath up on the map extended all the way down into what we know as Indochina. And so this complexity, this geographic complexity, left most Americans absolutely baffled. And you see there the quotation on the screen from President Truman, who confessed that China was just an idea. It wasn't a nation state. The reason Henry Luce's Time magazine was successful is it provided a simplifying fairy tale to make sense of this mind-bending complexity in China. Now, President Roosevelt was equally baffled. Everyone was baffled. There was very little knowledge of what was happening in China at the time. So Roosevelt decided, under much pressure from his intelligence agencies and branches in the military, let's send a team of Americans to go meet Mao and to discover who are the communists? What are they doing? What are they about? Who are these guys? And so the photo here you can see in the middle, one of my heroes, one of the main figures in the book, is that's John P. Davies Jr. And this is a photograph that was given to me by his granddaughter. And you can see he's in the mountains. He's meeting with Mao and all of Mao's lieutenants. And what's interesting, this became called the Dixie Mission because they were behind rebel lines. So there was this echo of the Dixies in the Civil War here. What's interesting is all the Americans who went to meet Mao were people who had been either born in or raised in or studied in China. So they were fluent in the language, they knew the culture, they knew the customs, they loved the people, and they loved the country. And so here's John Davies. Roosevelt sends him up into the mountains. And the question Roosevelt wanted to know is, will the communists fight against Japan? Could they be possible allies? Or will they be partners with Chiang? And what's their post-war leadership possibility after the war? What happens is Davies and all of his guys love Mao, and they really love Zhou Enlai. They're going for horseback rides through the mountains. They're playing volleyball. They're playing softball. One of my favorite stories is I discovered this wacky letter in a box that Davies' granddaughter gave to me. that, this is before TV, there's no radio, there's nothing. So at night, what do, right? So they played a lot of cards and they also played Monopoly. John P. Davies had brought Monopoly to the Chinese. And given the fact that Monopoly is a critique of capitalism, the communists loved it. And he tells the story in this letter that one night Mao and Zhao took the board from Davies and said, "Hey, can we borrow this? We'll bring it back tomorrow." And they redid the board so that all of the American properties, from Atlantic City and New York City and so on, became Chinese properties named after famous properties in Shanghai and so on. And it's just a funny story to show the coming together of the Chinese communists and the American diplomats. They really understood each other, they liked each other, they hung out together. The problem is all of the reports these guys sent back to Washington were secret. So only the White House was reading them. So the public discourse was being shaped by Henry Luce and Time magazine. Those in the know were reading these reports from the Dixie mission, but they weren't public. So it wasn't changing public consciousness about what's happening in the war. Now, the China hands, that's the friends of China, the folks who are fluent. I'm giving you here on the screen, you can see a list of some of their prominent names. This is John P. Davies Jr., David Barrett, and I'm particularly fond of Barrett because Barrett is from Colorado. And Jeremy, you'll love this. Barrett's reputation was that he had the best Mandarin of any living American. So much so that he would, at night, after these big dinners, Barrett would recite Shakespeare in Mandarin to the communists, which they just loved. So Barrett was one of these guys. John S. Service was there. So they're these old friends and fans of China. There was also a group of journalists with them. Now, I don't know if you've known any of these names: Brooks Atkinson, Edgar Snow, Martha Gellhorn, who was Ernest Hemingway's 32nd wife, Kate Mitchell, Agnes Smedley, Teddy White. These are all just incredible journalists in the field suffering hardships. And so I've given you a quote there from Mr. Davies. The thing that all of the observers united around was how much they hated Chiang Kai-shek. And I don't know if you in your classwork have gotten up to this point in history, but Chiang Kai-shek was, pretty much universally understood to be a fascist, and an incompetent one at that. And so you can see the quote from Davies saying, "Chiang's KMT are dispirited, shambling legions, failed by a decadent, corrupt bureaucracy." And he said they can neither defeat the Japanese forces nor the CCP. And here's the big thing. Davies, Barrett, Service, these guys were realists. Their great fear was that they could see that World War II was ending. They also could see the writing on the wall. There was no way the KMT could win the Chinese Civil War. So Mao and the communists were what was coming. And for the China hands, the question was, do we want these dudes to be our allies? Or do we want to push them into the waiting arms of Stalin? At this point, you remember the Americans, we had been allied with Stalin during the war, but it was very clear, even as early as 43, Stalin was clearly a sociopath. So the question is, do you want to try to work with the communists so that America can have a role in post-war China? Or do you want to jettison the communists, in which case they'll fall straight into Stalin's arms, which is exactly what happened. So that was the debate that was happening at the time. And I've given you here the cover of one of the prominent magazines at the time, Amerasia. Fantastic journal, full of information. But again, only the literati were reading this. It had virtually no public impact. Now, look at the photograph. Photograph on the right. It's a fantastic photograph. I've already said they went horseback riding. They played cards. They were doing Monopoly. They did folk dances. They just, had to find ways to occupy themselves at night. And one of the things that the Chinese communists loved to do is they would do theater. They were staging plays all the time. So here you can see that on D-Day, when the Americans first, came ashore in the European theater, the communists did a celebratory play. And here what they're doing is they've formed a boat. And the guy's holding hands in front. That's the prow of the boat going through the water. And that's supposed to be Eisenhower standing on the shoulders of his allies commanding the troops. So I wanted you to see this photograph that the communists really saw themselves as part of this international war against fascism. They clearly saw themselves at the time as allied with American democracy against fascism. And so here's a quote that Chairman Mao says to these guys. Again, they're there, they're interviewing him, they're taking note. And look at this amazing thing he says. We will accept your help with gratitude. We would serve with all our hearts under an American general with no strings or conditions attached. The thinking, remember, nobody knew about the bomb yet. The bomb was a total secret. The thinking at the time was that the American Navy was going to land our forces on mainland China. And working with the communists, we would then, from China, invade Japan that way. Now, those plans fell apart because of the bomb, but nobody knew that at the time. So when Mao says we'd serve under an American general, what he's saying is, yeah, land your forces in communist territory in North China, and from there we will attack China. Or sorry, from there we will attack Japan. And the question, the great debate, this has been, argued over for 50 years, is this an example of what historians have called red deception? Was Mao lying? Or was Mao sincere in his offer to work with America at the time? No, and nobody really knows. There's not a clear answer. I think, and the point of my book is that Mao was sincere then, and he changed his mind very quickly later because of the things I'm going to show you here in the forthcoming slides. So the thing to know, so the first part of the argument here is that China's in a state of chaos. The American diplomats feel very positive about what communism could be and could become, but all of their comments are for eyes only, and so they're not moving the public needle. So, to move the public needle, Roosevelt does another thing. So, Roosevelt sends all these linguistically fluent, culturally adept, incredibly educated people to meet with the communists. And then he does this really weird thing where he sends the gentleman in this photo. This is Major General Patrick Hurley. He sends Hurley to go to Chongqing to hang out with Chiang. And Hurley, if you just look at him there, he's right, this big, tall, strapping dude with blonde hair, square jaw. He had served with distinction in World War I. He had been the Secretary of War under the Hoover administration. He'd become a millionaire. Very, very prominent Republican figure. People were talking about Hurley as a potential presidential candidate. And in fact, there was some, kind of chatter amongst Roosevelt's friends that, hey, let's get Hurley out of the way for the possible election by sending him to China. The problem is Hurley, I suspect if he got diagnosed today, they'd say Hurley has dyslexia. He really didn't like reading. He didn't like writing. He was not a lettered individual. He's this kind of rough and tumble, tough dude. And Teddy White, one of the great journalists, just says, no, Hurley wasn't ignoramus. And Colonel Wilbur Peterkin, who served under him, said, no, Hurley was just a senile old man. But remember Time put Chiang Kai-shek on their cover. They loved Chiang. They hated the communists. And so in Time, they described him as handsome, irascible Patrick Hurley, who killed a fractious mule by bashing its head in with a 2x4. That tells you the values of heartland Americans, right? They didn't want multilingual diplomats. They wanted a guy with a 2x4 killing a barn animal. That's who Patrick J. Hurley was. So they send Patrick. So Roosevelt now has got one team meeting the communists, and he's got Hurley meeting Chiang. And the problem here, I'm titling this Hurley's Alternative Reality, give you a little parallel there, a little rhyme with the Trump administration, is that Hurley is utterly unfit for his position. So Teddy White was one of the great journalists of the age. He's at a cocktail party with Teddy White, and he shouts at Teddy White, "You're an un-American, goddamn seditious little son of a bitch." So turning critics into enemies. This should sound very familiar to those of you following contemporary politics. In this super duper long memo he wrote back to the Secretary of State on Christmas Eve, 1944, he portrays Chiang as Abraham Lincoln, and he uses the direct quote that Chiang is creating a government of the people, for the people, by the people. Now, A, nothing could be farther from the truth. But B, what's interesting is to see that this guy's a diplomat. He's been sent by the president. And yet, in his memos back to the White House, he's writing fairy tales. That's bad policy, right? You don't get good foreign policy outcomes when your advisors are writing you fairy tales. So he's turning his critics into enemies, and he's coming up with fairy tale solutions. When asked what was going wrong in China, he blamed all the trouble on what he called, quote, imperialist foreigners like the Netherlands, France, Britain, Canada, and Australia. Now, I don't know how much you all have dived into the theater in World War II, but I can guarantee you that Australia, Canada, and France and the Netherlands had no role. Britain had a very complicated role, but the other four had no role in wartime China. So he's externalizing blame by misreading the context. By 1945, he basically just says on his own, makes a unilateral statement that he won't negotiate with the communists anymore. So he's ending the possibility of peace, basically allowing the Civil War to happen. And while he's doing all this, he also fired so many people that it became a phrase that one was getting hurlied out of China. And so for those of you who followed the work of Doge, destroying the National Security Council, destroying the State Department, Hurley was doing this, in 1945, basically firing anybody he disagreed with. And so what this meant, by this time he'd been appointed to ambassador. So now he's the ambassador of the United States to China in an office in Chongqing with no staff because he's fired all of his China experts. So he's governing in a vacuum. He's leading American relationships in China in a vacuum. He's got no support. All of the knowledgeable field people are gone. But Hurley does all of this in public. So Hurley is winning the public relations battle. And so here's just a kind of quick summary. So despite the goodwill in Yan'an, that's up in the mountains where my heroes are meeting with Mao, the summer of 1945 is just complete chaos. Even after Japan surrenders, they leave 1 million troops in Manchukuo. The U.S. then airlifted KMT troops north, ostensibly to help the defeated Japanese troops get back to Japan, right? Because they didn't even have the capacity to return home. And instead of helping the Japanese leave, Chiang enlists the just defeated Japanese army to serve as his security forces. Now, I want you to think about, imagine what this does throughout China when they learn that the just defeated invading Japanese empire has been deputized by Chiang to be his security forces so his troops can fight the communists. Absolute madness. Stalin, by this time, is marching in from the northwest, and Stalin is there not because he wants to make peace, but he's just ripping off everything. All the factories are getting stripped. All the warehouses are getting stripped. So Stalin is essentially raping northern China to take stuff back to Russia. Chiang has enlisted the Japanese to fight the communists. Truman at this point is just losing his mind. He's so confused. And Churchill, oh, poor Mr. Churchill. Churchill sees all of this and his response is, I want my colony back. And so everybody, Roosevelt, Hurley, the communists, Chiang, everybody hates Churchill at this point. He's just this doddering old fool who wants his empire back. And post-colonial nationalism is erupting regionally. So the whole region is in turmoil. I was going to read you a long passage from the book, but I'll just say that the region it's chaos. It's absolute chaos. And as the ambassador in China, for Hurley to say, don't worry, Chiang will fix it because Chiang is Abraham Lincoln, you get the sense, right? It's just total insanity. There's no way this can possibly work. So, because Hurley is this delusional, senile old man, he's getting killed in the press. He's just getting eviscerated. And in the book, I do this really long riff where I go through congressional debates and Senate debates and show you that Hurley's just getting killed. So, because he's getting killed, he resigns. It's November 27th, 1945. And he does it not by telling the president that he's resigning or by telling the Secretary of State that he's resigning. He does it by releasing this wicked memo. And his wicked memo is the playbook for McCarthyism. And so I've given you here in bullet points some of the things his wicked memo does. He accuses the White House of complicity with communists. He says that the mess in China is not due to all of the various complex forces of history, but because of treason and sabotage. He says the Third World War is coming. The second one has just ended. He's already predicting a Third World War. And it's pretty much a testament of madness. And many people mocked it at the time. But the next day, Senator Kenneth Wherry, one of his allies, rises on the floor of the Senate, reads Hurley's memo, and then says, quote, the loss of China is due to an insidious conspiratorial minority of foreign agents and their dupes working destruction from within. And this is where now, so this is 1945, right? McCarthy doesn't make his famous willing speech until 1950. So 5 years before McCarthy becomes famous, here what you're seeing is the rhetorical playbook of McCarthyism. And I've given you the front page of the New York Times there. You can see that was the cover the day Hurley resigned. Now, again, the literati, anybody who knows the facts, anybody who knew what was happening, thought that Hurley was a clown. So here's a political cartoon from the Chicago Sun. Now, within American media history, the Chicago Tribune is and always has been this extreme right-wing bag of trash. They've got a great sports section. I used to live there, so I read their sports section, which is great, but it's a terrible newspaper. The Chicago Sun, which is now called the Chicago Sun-Times, was a really good newspaper. So the Chicago Sun published this fantastic political cartoon of Mr. Hurley as a cowboy running down the streets, just firing wildly, shooting at everybody. So before we go on, I want to hear your comments from the audience. Anybody want to riff on this image and what you're seeing and what this says to you about the tenor of the times?
Got us unmuted here now in the classroom, Stephen. Edgar, do you want to jump in?
Oh, sure. I mean, I do like how they're actually depicting him like, I'm gonna say, John Wayne character, that he's like, like the banks, boom at Russia, bang at the US Department. It's almost like they're depicting him less like a hero and more like a loose cannon.
Loose cannon. And Javier, also jump in, please.
I was just say kind of what they were already talking about him, senile old man. This guy just shooting, well, Wagner was saying just blanks,
Shooting blanks
kind of that,
and a sort of John Wayne loose cannon.
yeah.
Not pretty much.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, your comments are just so accurate. Remember that at this time in American history, John Wayne was the single largest drawing actor in the American cinema. And so this is very clearly mocking Hurley to say, you're just like John Wayne. You're this, brain dead cowboy firing blanks, romping down the street. So yeah, great comment there that it's very much like a John Wayne riff. I also want to draw your attention to the title of the image at the bottom of the page. The Werner was the artist, and Werner called this the gripes of wrath. And remember that just before this, John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath had won a series of literary awards for being this amazing portrayal of the complexities of American life. So he's mocking Hurley as being a kind of B-rate John Wayne, but he's also making fun of his anger to say, in comparison to Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, which is, rich and deep and evocative. This is just foolishness. This is the gripes of wrath. So Hurley is getting crushed in the public. Everybody's making fun of him. He's clearly an old fool. He's just a clown. And then, lo and behold, so Hurley is so offended that he demands a hearing. He demands a public session. And this becomes called the Hurley Affair. And so, figuring they would, okay, we'll help you make a fool of yourself, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee organizes a hearing, which opens on December 5th. And here you see a picture of Hurley. He's got his hand raised. He's shouting at the committee. The transcripts, one of the whole chapters of the books is just an analysis of the transcript of these Senate Foreign Relations hearing. And what's intriguing is that Hurley just gets obliterated. Everything he's saying is either historically wrong or factually wrong. He's contradicting himself. Again, he's, you got to almost feel bad for the guy. He's just a senile old clown. And he gets killed in the meetings. And the next day, the front page of the New York Times, I've given you the headline here, Hurley accuses 5 officials of sabotaging China policy. Says 2 sought Chiang's ruin. So here the paper of record says to America that your ambassador is declaring treason is why we're losing China. What they don't say is that those claims were debunked in the hearing. So what's happening here is we're having a bifurcating discourse community. Those in the know with knowledge are having private debates, whether it's in the Senate Foreign Relations or via these private meetings in the White House. And yet there's this public discourse, and you can see the public discourse is echoing his accusations. This is a really remarkable moment where we're seeing this split between what the press is saying and what's happening behind closed doors. So this happens in early December. Hurley again is obliterated, but the press repeats his charges, and boom, the Patrick J. Hurley papers are at this little place called the Western History Collection. It's in this beautiful old building on the main quad of the University of Oklahoma. So I take a road trip to go look at the Hurley papers. And in the Hurley papers, they've got boxes and boxes and boxes and little like magic markers on the side. The archivist wrote fan mail. So I open these boxes up and I start reading Hurley's fan mail. And I took this photograph to show you this is what it looks like. He's got a radio telegram. He's got a Western Union. You can see the top one on the left is from the Missouri House of Representatives. The one on the left is from a church. And so Hurley is getting killed by the literati who think he's a clown. But lo and behold, the American people love Patrick J. Hurley. And so I went through thousands of these letters and telegrams and postcards. And it's basically all these like small town farmers and cowboys and little, folks from small towns in the Midwest. And they love Patrick Hurley and they think he's getting screwed by the East Coast elite. So what we're seeing here is the emergence of a persecuted folk hero who can stand in opposition to those damn East Coast elites. And what this evolves into, and this is where the echoes of Trump just get wild, Hurley calls his position Americanism. He identifies himself as an Americanist. And in his letters to all of his supporters, he constantly says things like, let's put America first. And on the bottom right of the slide, I've given you a letter from the American Nationalist Committee. And these are basically, Christian fascists. And you can see their letter begins, "My dear General, your demonstrated courage." And they go on from there. So basically, the fascists write to Hurley to say, hey, we'd like to run you for office. So Hurley is getting this incredible groundswell of support from alienated small town folk, Christian nationalists, Christian fascists, and so on. And I've given you here a series of quotations from the letters in which the people identify their Midwestern horse sense, common sense, versus Washington's double talk. There's a lot of people saying, God bless you for giving the opposition hell. They claim that FDR and Truman are soft on China. They deride jackass congressmen, etc., etc., etc. What's really interesting when you read through the letters is that almost nobody talks about China. So Hurley comes to prominence as the ambassador to China. He resigns because of things in China. But when he becomes a folk hero, it's because they see him as this persecuted working class dude getting hammered by snobby East Coast elites. And China drops out of the discourse. So China is just this kind of background noise creating the arguments about what is a true American, what is American democracy. So this is all unfolding now in 1945. And boom, look at this incredible cartoon on the left. The China lobby guy in the suit, that's Alfred Kohlberg. I haven't talked about him. We can talk about him later if any of you are Alfred Kohlberg fans. He's the secret glue behind McCarthyism. He's the financier. He's the ideological driver and the financial driver. You see Chang on the left, who we've already talked about. You see McCarthy on the right with his perpetual 5 o'clock shadow because he was always either drunk or hungover. Dean Acheson is the Secretary of State who's just being a coward. And State Department careers, those are my guys. That's Davies, right? That's service. And they're about to get their head chopped off because the sensation of Hurley's populism is what becomes McCarthyism. And I've just given you here a series of events on the right. You probably all, you're familiar with these dates, right? You see September 23rd is when Americans first learned that the Russians had a nuke. The next week, Mao announces the foundation of the People's Republic of China. So that's the final defeat of Chiang. In January 5th, Senator William Noland again read Hurley's resignation on the floor of the Senate. And when commentaries opened up, Hurley piles on, McCarthy piles on. And then later that week, you see all these newspapers I listed for you, the Saturday Evening Post, Reader's Digest, Plain Talk, Chicago Tribune, Washington Times Herald. Basically, all of America's right-wing outlets echo these claims. So even though they're factually wrong, historically dubious, philosophically shallow, this becomes the dominant public discourse. And then boom, just a couple weeks later, February 9th, 1950, is when McCarthy makes his famous Wheeling speech, which is always historically considered the beginning of McCarthyism. So what I'm trying to show you here is that McCarthyism is just the blossoming of what Hurley and Kohlberg have been doing and saying about China for 5 years before that. So I'm trying to give you the kind of rhetorical backstory on McCarthyism. And then by the end of the book, what I offer you all is this template. So I'm coming from communication. I think that our public life is not only colored by our language, but driven by our language. I think the way we speak drives our politics. And so what I've given you here is a series of what I call tropes, meaning conversational patterns that emerge from Hurley and McCarthyism. And so colloquial catastrophizing is where we constantly predict doom to create fear because psychologists know that people who are scared are more likely to succumb to propaganda. So creating fear is functional. I call that colloquial catastrophizing. Paralyzing defeatism always portrays America as weak and losing. Reactionary populism blames that losing not on global complexities, but on corrupt US elites. Evidentiary misdirection, this is a big one. There's a whole chapter in the book on this. Evidentiary misdirection is where you blow up people's ability to make logical arguments by baffling them with chains of causality, loops of misdirection. The trope of conspiracy replaces cause and effect with treason. The rhetoric of perfectionism, this is a big part of it, is it portrays negotiations, diplomacy, compromise as weak in favor of strong unilateral declarations. And quotational patriotism. Hurley he could not give a speech without quoting the Declaration of Independence, the Magna Carta, you name it. Pick a classic American text, and Hurley would always quote them in his speeches, never understanding what they stood for, what they meant, just quoting them as kind of memes, as like cultural touchstones. So if you add up those bullet points, that is the rhetorical structure of McCarthyism. And what's really freaky is when you look at them, you could change the names and say, wow, that's the rhetorical structure of Trumpism. Virtually the same rhetorical structure, the same set of enemies, the same set of allies. And so that's where the book kind of swerves at the end from being this rhetorical history of World War II and the Chinese Civil War and saying, wow, this looks like the political foreground of where we are today. And so for me, that renders the book in a kind of somber and sad tone, but I think it also should equip you all as critics with the critical vocabulary to make sense of not only what happened then, but what is happening with Trumpism today. So I'll stop there. I'm hoping that gives you enough to kind of start now throwing out questions or comments. We can go into conversation mode. Is that all right, Jeremy?
That is great. Let's give Dr. Hartnett a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hope that comes through with a noise canceling, but you got a nice hearty round of applause here and folks on Zoom. Really, I wish it wasn't so damn relevant, Stephen. It's extremely timely. You give us these tools. You help us with what is I call the pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the spirit, which I think is
nice.
We can be take time to be overwhelmed by the sort of haunting of the anti-intellectualism anti-expertise and so much more. But also take heart in the kind of tools that you're giving us here to understand and to grapple with this, and also to find. I agree in these some of these figures like service and service and Jack Service, and who's the other one you're focusing on?
John Davies is
John
the big one.
Davies. And these other figures that are so impressive, and I was reminded of the role of people, really complex roles of people in this time. You mentioned John Steinbeck, but also Pearl Buck, Dalton Trumbo, Ernest Hemingway, Martha Gellhorn, Pete Seeger, Humphrey Bogart, Danny Kaye, Woody Guthrie, Barbara Tuchman also is an interesting figure. A little bit later, she comes in to play a different role. So this, we also have in this moment figures like Service and Davies and many others who are really exciting touchstones of history and who are grappling with this, sometimes with humor, sometimes with really good scholarship, but are definitely actively grappling with this. And of course, we know the result, and we list on the other side of those names that I just listed, names like Hurley and McCarthy and Cohen and Nixon and these other figures, and they're definitely occupying a very different space in history. So that also gives me some cause for hope and sort of empowerment in what you're doing here. I'm just so grateful for this really terrific book. What comes through most clearly for me, and then I want to open it to. Sorry, I'm pulling rank here for just a second, and then I'll open to questions. It's something that came through when I was working with the students in Taiwan. There were about half Taiwanese and half foreign students. It was a really terrific group of students, but they grasped right away how fluid and dynamic the state of U.S.-China relations is all the way from the beginning. And that has something to do, I think, with domestic political rivalries and shifting currents within the American cultural, political, social conversation. And that comes through really clearly, because we all maybe look for these sort of touchstones. We look for these historical moments or historical figures, and there's an assumption that they are static. But what comes through very clearly in the book is how fluid, how dynamic the state of U.S.-China relations are at any given time, really down to the day, so that you show how from the time of a testimony to the time of the news headline in the next day, there's a shift where what maybe a bunch of senators think just happened is revealed to be something else. Really in just the course of a day. And the role of figures like Henry Luce, the troubling aspects of white Christian nationalism, which is obviously ever present, gives me, I think, a lot to think about. I'm wondering about these fan mail letters a little bit, and where we're in the early phase of the radio still the first couple decades really of radio communication. Are there radio shows, and I'm thinking of like Oh Brother Where Art Thou, and that's my only sort of frame of reference here in terms of the 30s and then into the 40s. Are there radio programs that the kind of folks who are sending early fan mail are going to be tapped into here, in which they kind of equate the invasion of alien body snatchers with communism already at this point? Is that something that's starting to appear in terms of just from a historian to a communication scholar? I think I'd be interested to hear what kind of water these folks are swimming in culturally to be writing letters like that to Hurley.
Wow. Oh, Jeremy, that's just a great response. You've said at least four things I want to respond to real quickly, and I'll do them in order if that's all right.
Yeah.
You mentioned Hemingway, and I think you students will love the fact that, Hemingway at this point is a best-selling novelist. He's a world-renowned war reporter. He's a real figure. He's a real, he's an influencer, right? Before there's social media, there's Hemingway. Hemingway goes to China on he's sent to China by the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. He's sent as a spy. Uh, and he brings his brand new wife, Martha Gellhorn. And Hemingway, if you've read all the biographies, Hemingway's just this lunatic, right? He's this drunk, raging, you know, just this blast of crazy masculine energy. So Hemingway spends a couple months in China getting drunk every night and starting bar fights. His wife, Martha Gellhorn, turns out to be among the best journalists of the age. And so the OSS sends Hemingway to China to report. He just gets drunk and starts bar fights. And his wife, Martha Gellhorn, writes some of the best reporting on the war in China. So that's just a funny aside. You mentioned Hemingway. His wife, Martha Gellhorn, if you really want to read some great reporting, go check out Martha Gellhorn, Hemingway's wife. And she divorces him very quickly, by the way. Second thing I'll say, Jeremy, you mentioned the shifting currents in the US. What's really interesting is when you go into the communist archives, it's very clear that the communists are tracking shifts in American politics, and again, almost to the daily level. Mao is very clearly building his political ideology in response to what he thinks is happening in America. So when he thinks we can be allies, he talks about democracy. And by the time Hurley goes off the rails and McCarthy rises, Mao is reading the tea leaves and saying, things have changed in America, we can't be allies. He turns to Stalin. So it's interesting to know that US-China relations, it's always bilateral, but it's very often Chinese politics following the cues they're getting from American politics. I'm glad you picked up on that, Jeremy. And the third thing I'll say, you asked about the radio and so on. What's interesting is the biggest media outlets at the time are Time, Life, and the Chicago Tribune. They're the three-headed horsemen of conservatism in America. Reader's Digest is also becoming the largest kind of public outlet, and Reader's Digest has its own radio show, the Town Hall of America. And so all of these letter writers to Hurley, they're getting their stuff from Reader's Digest, Time, Life, Chicago Tribune, and the Town Hall of America radio show. So yeah, those are the kind of the media drivers of the age.
That's great. Thank you, Stephen. And Chuck had a couple questions in the chat, and then I saw Javier had a hand again. Anybody who wants to either raise hand in the classroom after Javier and then back to Edgar. But Chuck had a question first, a big one. Should the US have supported Mao? And that's, again, Tuckman had an essay about that. And then was the news slanted at that time period, not reporting object? I think we actually, Chuck, that second question got answered after you asked it a little bit from Stephen. So the first question, a big one, the US and its potential support for Mao and what that might have looked like if Mao
Okay.
to Washington.
Chuck, that's a great question. And yeah, Tuckman has this, classic essay where she about what would happen if Mao had come to Washington. And before I answer your question, just that classic Barbara Tuckman essay, Had Mao Come to Washington. In 44, Mao, Zhou, and the other communist leaders very clearly realized that Hurley was this senile old man with whom they could not work. And so through back channels, they appealed to the FDR White House to say, look, we can't work with your ambassador. Can we come to Washington? We'd like to enlighten you. That didn't happen. And Tuckman's classic essay is about what would have happened had Mao come. I want to answer Chuck's question, though, by going back to our map here. Can you all see it on the screen, Jeremy?
Yes, we can. Sorry, I was looking to pull up the Tuckman essay, but go ahead. Yeah, we can see it.
So the concern in Washington at the time was that if the U.S. allied with Mao and lost Chiang, the concern is what would the repercussions for China have been? But if you look at the map, the part that's called nationalist China is a very small part of China. And this map is from 3 or 4 years before the so-called Ichigo offensive in 44, at which point the pink part of the map covered the whole eastern seaboard of China. So should the US have allied with Mao? I think clearly yes, because it would have been some temporary chaos, but as I'm showing you here, was already temporary chaos. And by not allying with Mao, we sent Mao into the arms of Stalin. This in turn fueled the Chinese Civil War. And the Chinese Civil War is, this genocidal affair. I mean, millions of people are killed. There are upwards of 100 million homeless Chinese people roaming the countryside. I want you to think about that. There's only 325 million living Americans today. And in China, in 45, there's 100 million displaced people roaming the countryside. So it's absolute chaos. Mao's team was better equipped to feed the peasants, to reallocate the land, to build some semblance of local governance, because Chiang had no interest in doing any of that. Now, the irony, of course, is that Chiang flees to Formosa, and like Jeremy, I'm a huge supporter of Taiwanese independence. I love Taiwan. I go every year. I have lots of friends there. What has happened in Taiwan is a miracle. But in 44 and 45, for the US to back Chiang means that we're on the wrong side of history. And here's the worst part. India is on the verge of a democratic revolution against the British Empire. Indochina is on the verge of a democratic revolution against the French Empire. All of Southeast Asia is overthrowing their colonial overlords in the name of national independence. By siding with Chiang and kicking the communists to Stalin, we set the stage for the war in Korea, for the war in Vietnam, and for endless civil wars throughout the region. It's intriguing to say, what would have happened if we had aligned with Mao and supported democracy against all these colonial empires throughout the region? The entire history of Southeast Asia would be different had we made that decision, but we didn't. But so to answer Chuck's question, it would have taken courage. And at this time, FDR was much more interested in smashing Hitler than in thinking about Southeast Asia. And so they made the wrong choice.
Yeah, to court. I think that's important. I've recently been going into Taiwanese history just to clarify the sort of ambiguity of the language here in terms of Taiwan autonomy or Taiwan ability to rule itself, or a sort of peaceful status quo, whatever form that takes. I think I kind of defer to the views of the Taiwanese people, which in this case favor a spectrum of the status quo, whether it's short-term, near-term, long-term. But I refer everybody to Dr. Hartnett's extensive work on Taiwan specifically, which is also extremely insightful. And Chuck said this is an amazing insight. There's so much to think about, and really the fluidity again of this, it becomes apparent. I'm thinking ahead to rapprochement, which is sold by some as a sort of coup by everybody's favorite Henry Kissinger. And I think when we kind of take a step back and see, as Dr. Hartnett is kind of indicating, the way in which the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party is able to understand and to some extent read and anticipate moves by the sort of lumbering American political process, I think is really going to be on display, especially in the early 1970s. Tuckman, and then another interesting figure, Stilwell, and the sort of ghost of Stilwell is going to play an interesting role there when she gets her Pulitzer for that biography, which is another important factor. But Javier and then Edgar, we're going to jump in here.
Yeah, one of my questions was the communist propaganda that was going on during the 50s. Was it more heavily stayed on for the Russian side, or was it both sides when Mao, was like heavily influenced by, communists by Stalin? Was the propaganda more like on the side of Stalin's side, or was it more on the West end towards Russia?
Yeah,
or the Soviet Union?
That's a rocky relationship between not Beijing actually, but I should rather say Yan'an and Moscow. But Stephen, did you want to jump in on this? Did you catch Javier's question there?
Yeah, Javier, brother, that's a great question. Um, what's really interesting, and again, this goes back, Jeremy keeps talking about the fluidity. And what's interesting is that, by the middle of the Cold War, right? By the mid 60s, China is very clearly in a position where they're allied with the Soviet Union. But at this point in history, it's important to remember that Mao, like with a vengeance, Mao hates Stalin. And Stalin, in his psychopathic way, hates Mao. And there's, obvious historical reasons for this, right? China is always being colonized. China is always being invaded. China has not yet industrialized. And they see Stalin as just this kind of monstrous pig rolling in with his tanks and his modernization. So that they're like the worst kind of allies. Like they don't trust each other. They hate each other. They're constantly at war with each other. So Mao, the thing to remember that Mao is so tenuous at this point, right? He's got no allies. Chiang has a bigger army, Stalin has a bigger army, America has a bigger army. So Mao is playing everybody. He's just trying to see what's going to happen, what's going to shake out, who's going to come to his defense. So his propaganda is very situational. He says what he needs to say at a specific time to get a specific outcome. And people have said this is indicative of the fact that Mao's a liar. And I would say no, Mao is just really communicatively adept at doing what he needs to do to protect his people. So throughout this period, the 40s, what I'm talking about, Mao does not like Stalin. He thinks Stalin's version of communism is all wrong. And so they end up as allies, but they mostly end up as allies because we, the Americans, make that happen. That's a big part of my book, is that had we embraced Mao, there could have been a different outcome. But by the mid 50s, of course, Mao is also losing his mind. The Cultural Revolution happens, the wheels come off. And what's happened in American history is we read crazy Mao back into World War II Mao, but he wasn't crazy then. He was a good dude then. And so we're making it's kind of historically sloppy that we read Mao in the 40s through Mao in the 60s. That's a long way to answer your question, Javier. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense.
Thanks for the question, Javier. And excellent, Stephen. Agreed on all points. Edgar and then Terry. Edgar, go ahead, please.
Yeah, one of the questions the question that I was going to ask you was basically like you talk about like a lot of 1940s World War II in this presentation on the fact that the US was being involved in certain capacity of the in China, and I kind of like how you presented it because technically speaking, the US has had ironically, involvement in the Chinese fighting with the Japanese. It's just in the capacity of like, I don't remember the name of the unit, the Blind Tigers, which is basically what many people would call, oh, shark mouths. No, it's tigers. And I usually just use the term, they're kind of like plausible deniability. But was it during this time what you're talking about, were they being more involved in China policies instead of saying like we're denying these guys their plausible deniability? If they get captured by the Japanese, we just leave them up to their fate or figure out how to rescue them later.
Well,
Edgar, it's a great question, Edgar. It's a very complicated question. And one of the fun things about the book is, there's the White House is doing one thing, there's the State Department that's doing another, there's the OSS, the kind of precursor to the CIA, that's doing another thing, and then there's the Navy, which is doing its own thing. So there are multiple American agendas. And what's interesting for me is I've discovered all this evidence of how much the different parts of the American apparatus were angry at each other. And so, Edgar, you mentioned the Flying Tigers. So this is Claire Chennault's outfit. For those of you who know, Claire Chennault is essentially Oliver North during World War II, right? He is this rogue air commander. The Flying Tigers were not an American outfit. They were a private mercenary outfit being paid for by Chiang Kai-shek. So Claire Chennault has literally started his own private air force flying for Chiang. The White House hates Chennault, right? The last thing they want to do is have this rogue air force over there muddying up the issues. The OSS, which becomes the CIA, they're arming Mao. So the White House is saying, no, we can't work with you. The CIA is arming him, right? I found all these manifests of the explosives that the CIA was giving to Mao so that Mao could blow up Japanese trains to mess up the supply lines. So it's interesting, Edgar, you talked about plausible deniability. The White House says, we're not involved. The Navy says, we're involved, but only because we want to wage war against Japan. Chennault says, hell yeah, let's kill everybody who's a communist, but he's a mercenary, right? He's not wearing an American uniform, and the CIA is arming Mao. So it's just complete chaos. 4 different branches of the government, each with a different agenda in the region. And this is one of the regions, like if you go to China now, I go to China every summer, I run these conferences. Every single summer, a Chinese colleague will stand up and say, you've been trying to overthrow the Chinese government for 75 years. And I have to say, well, the CIA may be, but the White House not. Or the State Department may be, but not the Defense Department. And so it's important to understand that the American government is, and by design, has always been fractured. We have these dueling factions.
Yeah, that's a good question, Edgar, and thanks, Steve, for that. I think the Stilwell-Chennault rivalry has a really interesting dimension here too. Chennault is a big fan of Chiang Kai-shek personally, and the feelings are mutual, and so that runs very deep. And then the conflict with Stilwell, who is not an angel, I think, in any stretch, but is definitely errs on the side of very, very blunt statement of what he's seeing in Chiang Kai-shek is a big part of what makes Chiang Kai-shek not like Stilwell as a representative of FDR, and really kind of gravitate to Chennault, who will tell him everything he wants to hear, and also give him maybe some kind of American involvement on the cheap with the planes that he wants. That's a really that Chennault connection, and then I think Chennault's wife continues to play an important role in sort of hard right politics as well. That's another. That's such a rich world. These characters that you're bringing to life here, Stephen, and also making me think in these terms about these guys. Like there needs to be. Rhonda Minter's book, I think, was pretty good, giving us a revision of Stilwell. But I think the Stilwell-Chennault dynamic is another facet of the kind of domestic American view on U.S.-China relations here that I think is crucial. So that's the next book. Terry, jump in, please.
Wow, you brought up a lot of things when you mentioned Ollie North. It goes back to my question. I tried to ask it at the beginning, but my hand wasn't seen. And that was, why Chiang Kai-shek? We know his wife is immensely popular in the States, a Wellesley graduate, and she attended another college, I believe, in Georgia, and devout Christian. And when I think of China at the time, Christianity isn't all that popular compared to what the populists. So you're picking an unpopular fascist. And when you said Ollie North, I was there when we were supporting in El Salvador and Honduras and the Contras. I worked in logistics. I'm the old guy in the class. I don't know if you see me. But, and I kept saying, why do we pick Noriega as a bad guy? Why do we pick Juan Napoleon in El Salvador and his death squads? And I'm flying him ammunition down there thinking, what are we doing? Why Chiang Kai-shek. And it's just a defeat. And I like Uncle Joe Stillwell. He's kind of crazy, and Claire Chennault. By the way, Eisenhower released Navy and Army pilots, not Eisenhower, I'm sorry, Roosevelt, released these pilots from service to go. So he may say he doesn't like the mercenary not involved, but why did 100 Army pilots and mechanics get released? I've done a lot of research. I love that period.
That's interesting.
I fell into that group when I was working under General Secord in the Air Force, that we were supplying the Contras, and Hassan Fus kind of made it.
Were you asking Terry?
Why Chiang Kai-shek?
Why Chiang Kai-shek? And I just want to flag for Dr. Hartnett's time that we're getting close to the 3:45, somewhat hard stop time. But Stephen, your thoughts on why Chiang Kai-shek?
Okay. Well, so first I'm going to say, Terry, I'm sorry I'm so far away. I'd love to go for a beer with you and talk about the Iran cancer scandal. You sound like a fascinating guy. But why Chiang Kai-shek? Remember that, again, China is in a state of total chaos. The warlord period, millions of people die in internal civil war between 6, 7 different warring factions and armies. Go back to the map again. I've shown up here, right? Each of these, the Ma clique is essentially an armed fiefdom. The Guangxi region, an armed fiefdom. The drug dealing down around the Indochina, Yunnan, Burma border is epic. And there's no one to make sense of it. There's no one to make order of it. And Chiang, as the dominant commander in the early nationalist army back even in the Sun Yat-sen days, Chiang's the only guy with the authority to hold it together. So nobody likes him and nobody respects him, but we don't have a viable candidate to take his place. And so he kind of clings to power against everybody's best wishes. And he's also, he's just a murderous dictator. He takes out any potential rivals who could have been, better leaders. He assassinates most of his top generals. So Chiang by default, not because anybody liked him. It's just Chiang by default.
I didn't know he was going to fail. Even if we beat the communists, he was going to fall, and I know.
That's a good.
Right.
That's a good question, Alina, and I think you're right. Also, Stephen, Terry, to point to Song Mei Ling, to Madame Chiang Kai-shek place. There's a brand new book also about her and her place in the American imagination, which is very important. There's so much more here, but what you've done, Stephen, is you've gotten everybody very excited about the turn of the 20th century and charging the next stage of our studies here. And I've got two books here for a couple lucky students that I'll distribute. I think I have one more in my office that's going to go to another student. But thank you so much, Stephen. Please join me in giving Dr. Hartnett a round of applause. Great, thanks.
Jeremy, thank you for everything that you do. You've clearly created this beautiful community of inquisitive students thinking internationally in a time of xenophobia. So high five to you, brother. Good job.
Thank you, Stephen. I think I hope to find an excuse to talk to you again soon, because I know we have many common interests here, many interests from my work here with some friends in Project Rebound and lots of other things. So we have a lot to discuss for another time. But for now, just my great thanks to you for joining us, and I'll follow up with you by email. But thank you so much.
Right. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
All right. Bye-bye. Thank you.